The military transport truck rumbled through the dusty Afghan landscape, carrying its precious cargo toward Forward Operating Base Echo. Inside, 23-year-old Navy Hospital Corpsman Sarah Chen sat quietly among the elite Navy SEALs, her medical bag clutched tightly in her lap. The men around her spoke in low voices about their upcoming mission, but none addressed her directly. She was used to this treatment, the new medic who had to prove herself worthy of their trust. Sarah's dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her small frame seemed almost fragile compared to the muscular operators surrounding her. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing barely 120 pounds, she looked more like a college student than a combat medic assigned to one of the military's most elite units. The SEALs had requested a replacement for their injured corpsman, and headquarters had sent them Sarah. The team leader, Chief Petty Officer Mike Rodriguez, had made his displeasure clear when he first saw her. "This is what they send us?" Rodriguez had muttered to his second-in-command. "We need someone who can keep up, not a liability we have to protect." Sarah heard the comment but kept her expression neutral. She had faced doubt and skepticism throughout her military career, and she had learned that actions spoke louder than words. Her service record was impressive, though most of it remained classified. She had completed the grueling Special Operations Combat Medic course at the top of her class, earned her Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal, and served with distinction in several overseas deployments. But none of that mattered to these men until she proved herself in combat. The truck hit a pothole, jolting everyone inside. One of the younger SEALs, Petty Officer Jake Morrison, glanced at Sarah with barely concealed concern. At 19, he was the baby of the team, and despite his training, he still worried about having adequate medical support. His previous experiences with combat medics had been mixed. Some were heroes who saved lives under fire, while others cracked under pressure when bullets started flying. "How long you been doing this, Doc?" Morrison asked, using the traditional nickname for military medics. Sarah looked up from checking her medical supplies. "Long enough," she replied simply. Her voice was calm and steady, betraying none of the complex emotions beneath the surface. She didn't elaborate, and Morrison didn't push for more information. The truth was that Sarah had been serving as a combat medic for 5 years, but her story began long before she enlisted in the Navy. She had grown up in a military family. Her father was a Marine Corps veteran who served 3 tours in Iraq, and her older brother had followed in his footsteps. Sarah had always planned to pursue medicine, but the events of one terrible night had changed the course of her life forever. When she was 18 and in her freshman year of college, Sarah had been walking home from the library when she witnessed a brutal car accident. A drunk driver had slammed into a family's minivan, trapping the parents and their 2 young children inside the burning wreckage. Without hesitation, Sarah had rushed to help, using her basic first aid training to stabilize the victims while emergency responders were still en route. She managed to extract the children and perform CPR on the unconscious father, saving his life. The experience had been traumatic but also transformative. Sarah realized that she wanted to dedicate her life to helping others in their darkest moments. The truck began to slow as they approached the base perimeter. Through the dusty windows, Sarah could see the concrete barriers and guard towers that marked the edge of civilized safety in this hostile environment. Beyond the base lay Taliban-controlled territory, where every shadow could hide an enemy fighter, and every roadside pile of debris might conceal an improvised explosive device. Chief Rodriguez stood up and addressed his team. "Listen up, people. We're going out on patrol in 2 hours. Intelligence suggests there's insurgent activity in Grid Square 77 Alpha. Our job is to locate and neutralize any threats, gather intelligence, and return safely. Doc," he looked directly at Sarah, "your job is to stay close and keep us breathing. Can you handle that?" Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "Roger that, Chief. I won't let you down." Rodriguez nodded curtly, though his expression remained skeptical. He had been leading SEAL teams for 12 years, and he had seen plenty of medics come and go. Some were natural warriors who thrived in combat, while others were skilled healers who couldn't handle the violence and chaos of battle. He hoped Sarah would prove to be the former, but he wasn't taking any chances. He had already assigned Morrison to stay close to her during the mission, ostensibly as protection but really to keep an eye on her performance. As the truck came to a complete stop, the SEALs began gathering their gear and preparing to disembark. Sarah double-checked her medical kit one final time, ensuring that every bandage, medication, and piece of equipment was in its proper place. She had learned through hard experience that seconds mattered in combat medicine, and being organized could mean the difference between life and death for a wounded soldier. The rear door of the truck opened, flooding the interior with harsh Afghan sunlight and desert heat. The temperature outside was already approaching 100 degrees, and it wasn't even noon yet. The SEALs filed out one by one, their weapons ready and their eyes scanning for potential threats even within the relative safety of the base perimeter. Sarah was the last to exit, shouldering her medical pack and adjusting her body armor. As she stepped down from the truck, she felt the weight of 23 pairs of eyes watching her every move. The other personnel on the base had heard that a female medic had been assigned to the SEAL team, and they were curious to see how she would perform. Some looked skeptical, others appeared amused, and a few seemed genuinely interested in seeing whether she could live up to the reputation of her predecessors. But Sarah had faced worse scrutiny before, and she had always emerged stronger. As she followed the SEAL team toward their temporary quarters, she silently vowed that she would earn their respect through her actions, not her words. She had secrets that none of them could imagine, experiences that had forged her into something harder and more capable than her appearance suggested. Soon enough, they would all understand exactly who Sarah Chen really was. 2 hours later, the 8-man SEAL team moved through the Afghan countryside like ghosts in the fading daylight. Sarah followed behind Chief Rodriguez, her medical pack secure and her sidearm ready. The terrain was rocky and unforgiving, with deep ravines and scattered boulders providing both cover and potential hiding spots for enemy fighters. The team communicated through hand signals and whispered radio transmissions, maintaining strict noise discipline as they approached their target area. Sarah's boots found their rhythm on the rocky ground, and she moved with a fluid grace that surprised several of the SEALs. They had expected her to struggle with the pace and the challenging terrain, but she kept up effortlessly. Her breathing remained steady despite the altitude and the weight of her gear, and she never once asked for a rest break or showed signs of fatigue. Morrison, who had been assigned to watch over her, found himself impressed despite his initial reservations. The team had been moving for nearly 3 hours when Rodriguez suddenly raised his closed fist, the universal military signal to halt. Everyone froze in place, weapons at the ready, as the team leader scanned the area ahead through his night vision scope. In the distance, barely visible in the growing darkness, was a small compound consisting of 3 mud brick buildings surrounded by a low stone wall. Intelligence had suggested this might be a Taliban safe house, and Rodriguez was taking no chances. Tango 6, this is Bravo 7, Rodriguez whispered into his radio, reporting back to base. We have visual on the target compound. Proceeding with reconnaissance. The team spread out in a tactical formation, with each man covering a specific sector of fire. Sarah stayed close to the center of the group, her eyes constantly moving as she scanned for threats. Her medical training had taught her to observe everything around her, and she noticed details that others might miss. The way the shadows fell differently near one of the buildings, suggesting a possible lookout post, and the absence of normal sounds like insects or small animals, which could indicate that people were nearby. As they moved closer to the compound, Rodriguez used hand signals to position his men for the assault. 2 SEALs would approach from the north, 2 from the south, and the remaining 3 would provide overwatch from a small ridge about 200 meters away. Sarah would stay with the overwatch team, ready to move forward if anyone was wounded during the operation. The plan was simple and efficient, the kind of tactical approach that these elite operators had executed hundreds of times before. What they didn't expect was for everything to go wrong within the first 30 seconds. As the assault teams moved into position, a hidden sentry spotted one of the SEALs and opened fire with an AK-47. The distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire shattered the desert silence, and suddenly the night erupted in a chaos of muzzle flashes and shouting voices. The Taliban fighters had been waiting for them, turning what should have been a surprise raid into a deadly ambush. Contact front, Rodriguez shouted into his radio. Multiple hostiles were taking heavy fire. The SEALs immediately returned fire, their superior training and equipment giving them an advantage even in the confused darkness. But the Taliban fighters knew the terrain better, and they had prepared defensive positions that provided excellent cover. Bullets whined overhead as both sides exchanged fire, and the distinctive crack of an enemy sniper rifle added to the deadly symphony. Sarah pressed herself against a large boulder, her heart racing as she listened to the battle unfolding below. Through her night vision goggles, she could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions around the compound. The SEALs were pinned down, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to devastating crossfire. Then she heard the call that every combat medic dreads. "Corpsman up! Man down!" Morrison's voice came over the radio, filled with urgency and fear.
"Doc, we need you down here now."
"Rodriguez is hit bad." Sarah didn't hesitate. Despite the bullets flying overhead and the obvious danger of moving from cover, she grabbed her medical kit and sprinted down the rocky slope toward the trapped SEALs. Her fellow team members on the ridge provided covering fire, but she was still exposed for long stretches as she bounded from rock to rock. She found Rodriguez behind a low stone wall, blood seeping through his body armor where a bullet had found a gap near his shoulder. The wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening, though he was losing blood quickly. Morrison was applying pressure to the wound, but his hands were shaking from adrenaline and fear. "Report," Sarah commanded as she slid into position beside the wounded chief. Entry wound high on the right shoulder. "Possible damage to the subclavian artery," Morrison said, his medical training taking over despite his emotional state. "He's conscious but going into shock." Sarah quickly assessed the situation, her mind automatically running through the medical protocols she had memorized. The bullet had entered just above Rodriguez's collarbone and angled downward, potentially damaging major blood vessels. If the subclavian artery was severed, he could bleed out in minutes without immediate intervention. Working with practiced efficiency, Sarah cut away Rodriguez's uniform shirt and body armor to expose the wound. Blood was flowing steadily but not spurting, which suggested that the artery might be damaged but not completely severed. She applied a pressure bandage and started an IV line to replace lost fluids, all while bullets continued to crack overhead. "How bad is it, Doc?" Rodriguez asked through gritted teeth. "You'll live, Chief, but we need to get you out of here soon," Sarah replied calmly. "Can you move?" Before Rodriguez could answer, another SEAL's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got multiple wounded. Peterson's down, Jackson's hit in the leg." Sarah felt her blood run cold. 3 wounded men in a hostile environment, with enemy fighters still actively engaging them. This was every combat medic's worst nightmare. Multiple casualties in a situation where evacuation would be nearly impossible. The helicopter that had brought them to the area wouldn't be able to land under fire, and carrying 3 wounded men across miles of rough terrain was not an option. As if reading her thoughts, Rodriguez grabbed her arm with his good hand. "Doc, I need you to know something. There's no extraction coming. We're on our own until we can fight our way out of this." Sarah nodded grimly. She had suspected as much from the radio chatter she had overheard. The base was dealing with multiple incidents tonight, and resources were stretched thin. The SEAL team would have to rely on their own skills and determination to survive. "Then we make our own way out," she said simply. "But first, let's deal with these other casualties." Despite the danger, Sarah began moving from position to position, treating the wounded SEALs with a competence and calm that amazed the team. She stabilized Peterson, who had taken a bullet to the chest, and bandaged Jackson's leg wound while bullets whined overhead. Her movements were precise and efficient, showing none of the panic or hesitation that might be expected from someone facing their first serious combat situation. As she worked, the other SEALs began to notice something unusual about their new medic. She moved through the battlefield with a confidence that went beyond medical training, anticipating threats and finding cover with the instincts of an experienced combat veteran. There was something in her eyes, a hardness that spoke of previous experiences with violence and death that made them wonder about her past. The firefight had been raging for over an hour, and ammunition was running low. Sarah had managed to stabilize all 3 wounded SEALs, but their situation remained desperate. The Taliban fighters seemed to have unlimited rounds and showed no signs of retreating. Worse, radio intercepts suggested that enemy reinforcements were moving toward their position from the east. Peterson, the most seriously wounded, was drifting in and out of consciousness despite Sarah's efforts to keep him stable. The bullet had punctured his lung, and she had successfully inserted a chest tube to relieve the pressure. But he needed surgery soon or he would die. Jackson's leg wound was less serious but still required constant attention to prevent infection. And Rodriguez's shoulder injury had begun bleeding again despite the pressure bandage. "Doc, we need to move," Rodriguez said, his voice weak but determined. "We can't hold this position much longer." Sarah nodded, understanding the tactical situation even without military leadership training. They were outnumbered and surrounded, with limited ammunition and no hope of immediate rescue. Their only chance was to fight their way out and reach a defensible position where a helicopter could extract them safely. But moving 3 wounded men across hostile territory would be nearly impossible, especially with Peterson in his current condition. Sarah made a decision that would reveal more about her background than she had intended. "Give me 5 minutes," she told Rodriguez. "I'm going to thin out their numbers." Before anyone could protest, Sarah had stripped off her medical pack and picked up Peterson's rifle. The other SEALs watched in shock as she checked the weapon's condition and chamber, her movements showing a familiarity with combat firearms that went far beyond basic military training. "Doc, what are you doing?" Morrison whispered urgently. "You're a medic, not an infantryman." Sarah's eyes hardened as she studied the enemy positions through the rifle's scope. "Tonight, I'm whatever you need me to be." The Taliban fighters had grown careless during the long firefight, assuming that the pinned-down Americans posed no threat. They had established firing positions that provided good cover from the front, but left them exposed to flanking fire. Sarah had identified 3 key positions that were anchoring the enemy's defensive line, and she knew that eliminating them would create an opportunity for escape. Moving with a stealth and precision that shocked the watching SEALs, Sarah began working her way around the Taliban's left flank. She used every piece of cover available, timing her movements to coincide with bursts of friendly fire that would mask any sound she might make. Her progress was slow but steady, and within 15 minutes she had reached a position that gave her clear sight lines to all 3 target locations. The first Taliban fighter never knew what hit him. Sarah's shot took him in the center of mass, dropping him instantly. She had already shifted position before the other enemies realized what was happening, setting up for her second shot from a completely different angle. The second fighter fell as he tried to locate the source of the gunfire, and the third was eliminated as he attempted to retreat to a more secure position. The sudden loss of 3 key fighters threw the Taliban defense into chaos. Their remaining forces began firing wildly in all directions, unsure of where the new threat was coming from. In the confusion, Sarah managed to work her way back to the SEAL position without being detected. "How the hell did you do that?" Rodriguez asked, staring at Sarah with a mixture of amazement and suspicion. "Lucky shots," Sarah replied, but her tone suggested there had been nothing lucky about her performance. The elimination of the 3 Taliban fighters had created exactly the opening that Sarah had hoped for. The enemy's defensive line was broken, and their remaining forces were disorganized and demoralized. Rodriguez, despite his wound, took command of the tactical situation. "Morrison, Jackson, you help Peterson. I'll take point with Thompson and Williams. Doc, you stay in the middle and keep our wounded alive." The team began moving immediately, taking advantage of the confusion among the Taliban forces. Sarah had fashioned a makeshift stretcher from rifle straps and equipment, allowing 2 men to carry Peterson while maintaining some ability to fight. The injured SEAL was unconscious but breathing steadily, and his vital signs remained stable. Progress was slow and dangerous. Every few hundred meters, they encountered small groups of Taliban fighters who had been moving to reinforce the original ambush site. Each contact resulted in a brief but intense firefight, with the SEALs using their superior training and equipment to overcome numerically superior forces. During one of these encounters, Jackson's leg wound reopened and began bleeding heavily. Sarah managed to rebandage it while bullets flew overhead, working with a calm efficiency that continued to amaze her teammates. She seemed to anticipate where the enemy fire would come from, positioning herself and her patients to minimize their exposure to danger. "You're not just a medic," Morrison said during a brief lull in the fighting. "I've seen combat medics before, and they don't move like you do." Sarah didn't respond immediately, focused on checking Peterson's chest tube to ensure it was still functioning properly. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. "We all have our secrets," she said simply. As the night wore on, the team continued their fighting withdrawal toward a hilltop that would provide better defensive positions and a suitable landing zone for helicopter extraction. Rodriguez had managed to establish sporadic radio contact with their base, and a rescue mission was being organized. But they would have to hold out until dawn before any aircraft could safely operate in the area. The hilltop they were approaching had been the site of a fierce battle several months earlier, and the ground was still littered with abandoned equipment and fighting positions. Sarah recognized the tactical value of the location immediately, suggesting defensive improvements that impressed even the experienced SEALs. Set up interlocking fields of fire covering the approaches from the east and south, she recommended. The north side is too steep for an assault, and we can use those old foxholes to protect the wounded. Rodriguez looked at her with growing suspicion. How do you know this terrain so well? And how do you know so much about defensive tactics? Before Sarah could answer, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed across the valley below. Through their night vision equipment, the SEALs could see headlights moving along the dirt road that led to their hilltop position. The Taliban had brought reinforcements, including at least 2 technical vehicles mounted with heavy machine guns. Contact imminent, Rodriguez reported over the radio. We have enemy vehicles approaching from multiple directions. Request immediate air support. The response from base was not encouraging. Bravo 7, be advised that air support is not available for another 3 hours. You are authorized to use all necessary force to defend your position. Sarah checked her rifle and took up a position overlooking the main approach route. The SEALs had limited ammunition left, and the approaching Taliban force significantly outnumbered them. But as she settled into her firing position and began selecting targets, Sarah felt a familiar calm settle over her. This was not her first desperate last stand, and the skills she had learned in previous battles were about to save all their lives. The secrets of her past were about to be revealed in the most dramatic way possible, as the young medic transformed into something that none of the SEALs had expected to see. The first technical vehicle rounded the bend in the road, just as the eastern sky began to show the faintest hint of dawn. The heavy machine gun mounted in its bed opened fire immediately, sending streams of tracer rounds toward the SEAL position. Sarah had positioned herself behind a rocky outcrop that provided excellent cover, while giving her clear sight lines to the road below. Her first shot disabled the gunner on the technical, causing the vehicle to swerve wildly as the driver tried to avoid further fire. The second shot took out the front tire, sending the truck careening off the road and into a deep ditch. The surviving Taliban fighters scrambled out of the wreckage and began taking cover behind the disabled vehicle. But they were now trapped in a position with limited escape routes. Outstanding shooting. Doc, Thompson called out from his position 30 meters away. Where did you learn to shoot like that? Sarah didn't answer, focused on acquiring her next target. The second technical had stopped just out of direct line of sight, and she could hear the Taliban fighters organizing for a coordinated assault on multiple fronts. They had learned from their earlier encounters with the SEAL team, and were now approaching the hilltop with greater tactical awareness. Rodriguez, despite his wounded shoulder, was coordinating the defense with professional competence. He had positioned his remaining healthy SEALs to cover the most likely avenues of approach, while the wounded were secured in the deepest part of the old fighting positions. But even his experienced eye could see that their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Doc, I need you to stay with the wounded, he ordered. We can't afford to lose our medic in the assault. Sarah shook her head firmly. Chief, with respect, you need every rifle you can get. Peterson is stable for now, and Jackson can manage his own bandages. I'm more useful on the firing line. Before Rodriguez could argue, the Taliban assault began in earnest. Fighters emerged from cover positions all around the hilltop, advancing under the covering fire of their heavy weapons. The remaining technical vehicle had moved to a position where its machine gun could rake the SEAL positions, forcing the defenders to keep their heads down. Sarah's response surprised everyone. Instead of taking cover like the others, she stood up and began moving between positions, engaging targets with a precision and aggression that seemed impossible under such intense fire. She moved like a dancer through the battlefield, anticipating where the enemy fire would come from and positioning herself to avoid it while maintaining offensive pressure. Her shooting was extraordinary. Every round she fired seemed to find its mark, dropping Taliban fighters with clinical efficiency. She switched targets rapidly, never staying in one position long enough for the enemy to fix her location. In the space of 5 minutes, she had eliminated 8 fighters and forced at least a dozen others to abandon their assault positions. Morrison, who had been watching her performance with growing amazement, finally understood what he was seeing. Jesus Christ, he whispered to Thompson. She's not just a medic. She's some kind of special operations shooter. The Taliban commander apparently reached the same conclusion. The machine gun on the technical vehicle swiveled toward Sarah's position, sending a stream of heavy-caliber rounds that chewed up the rocks around her. She rolled away from the impact area and came up running, zigzagging across the open ground toward a position that would give her a clear shot at the vehicle. "Doc, get down," Rodriguez shouted, but Sarah was already committed to her movement. She reached the edge of the hilltop and dropped into a prone firing position, her rifle trained on the technical vehicle below. The range was nearly 400 meters, and the target was partially concealed behind a cluster of boulders. It was an extremely difficult shot under the best of circumstances, and nearly impossible while under fire from multiple directions. Sarah controlled her breathing and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the Technical's fuel tank, and the vehicle erupted in flames. The explosion lit up the pre-dawn darkness and sent secondary explosions rippling across the Taliban position as stored ammunition cooked off in the intense heat. The psychological effect on the attacking fighters was immediate and devastating. They had been told they were fighting a small group of wounded Americans, but the precision of Sarah's shooting and the destruction of their heavy weapons suggested they were facing a much more formidable opponent. Several groups of fighters began withdrawing without orders, and the coordinated assault dissolved into chaos. Rodriguez stared at Sarah in complete bewilderment. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Before Sarah could answer, her radio crackled with an incoming transmission. "Bravo 7, this is Raptor 6-1. We have visual on your position and are beginning our attack run." Two AH-64 Apache helicopters appeared over the valley, their chin-mounted cannons already seeking targets among the scattered Taliban forces. The arrival of close air support marked the beginning of the end for the enemy fighters, who found themselves caught in the open with nowhere to hide. Sarah used the distraction provided by the helicopter attack to check on her wounded patients. Peterson was still unconscious but breathing steadily, and his chest tube continued to function properly. Jackson's leg wound had stopped bleeding, and Rodriguez's shoulder injury showed no signs of infection. "Bravo 7, this is Dustoff 7-2, came another radio call. "We're inbound for medical evacuation. Yati 10 minutes. The medical evacuation helicopter would take the wounded SEALs to a field hospital where they could receive proper surgical care. But as Sarah prepared her patients for transport, she knew that her own situation had become much more complicated. Her performance during the firefight had revealed skills and knowledge that went far beyond what any normal combat medic should possess. Rodriguez approached her as the sound of rotor blades grew louder in the distance. "Doc, I've been in the Navy for 15 years and I've never seen anything like what you did tonight. You fought like someone with advanced special operations training." Sarah finished securing Peterson's IV line before responding. "Sometimes people are more than they appear to be, Chief." "That's not an answer," Rodriguez pressed. "I need to know who you really are. My men's lives depend on knowing whether we can trust you." The medical evacuation helicopter touched down in a swirl of dust and rotor wash, its crew immediately beginning to load the wounded SEALs. Sarah supervised the transfer, ensuring that each patient's medical condition was properly communicated to the flight medics. As Peterson was being loaded onto a stretcher, he regained consciousness for the first time in hours. His eyes focused on Sarah's face and he grabbed her hand with surprising strength. "Doc," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the helicopter noise. "I know who you are. I served with your unit in Iraq 3 years ago." Sarah's blood ran cold. Peterson had recognized her despite the different name and the passage of time. If he revealed her true identity, everything she had worked to build in the Navy would be destroyed. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "We've never met before." Peterson shook his head weakly. "Staff Sergeant Chen, 1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. You saved my squad when we got ambushed in Fallujah. I'd recognize your shooting anywhere." The other SEALs had heard enough of the conversation to understand the implications. Sarah Chen wasn't just a Navy medic. She was a former Army Ranger with combat experience that rivaled their own. The revelation explained her tactical knowledge, her shooting skills, and her calm performance under fire. Rodriguez stared at her with a mixture of respect and confusion. "Why didn't you tell us?" As the helicopter lifted off with its load of wounded SEALs, Sarah finally decided it was time to reveal the truth about her past. The secrets she had kept hidden for so long were about to be exposed, and there was no point in continuing the deception. Back at Forward Operating Base Echo, Sarah sat in the medical tent checking her equipment while the remaining SEALs gathered around her. The adrenaline from the firefight had worn off, leaving them exhausted but alive. Peterson's recognition of her true identity had opened a door that Sarah had hoped would remain closed forever. Rodriguez broke the silence first. "So you're really Army Rangers? That explains a lot, but it doesn't explain why you're here pretending to be just a Navy medic." Sarah looked up from cleaning her rifle, meeting the eyes of each SEAL in turn. These men had fought beside her and trusted her with their lives. They deserved to know the truth, even if it meant exposing the painful chapters of her past. "My name is Sarah Chen, and yes, I was a staff sergeant in the 75th Ranger Regiment," she began slowly. "I served 3 combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan as a Ranger medic. I earned a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star with V device for valor, and a Silver Star for actions during the Battle of Fallujah." Morrison whistled softly. "A Silver Star? That's serious business. What happened?" Sarah's expression grew distant as she recalled memories she had tried to bury. "My squad was pinned down by a complex ambush in an urban area. We had multiple casualties and no way to evacuate them. I spent 6 hours moving between wounded soldiers under heavy fire, keeping them alive until reinforcements could reach us." Thompson leaned forward, fascinated despite himself. "But why join the Navy after serving with the Rangers? That doesn't make sense." The question Sarah had been dreading finally came. She set down her rifle and looked out through the tent flap at the Afghan landscape beyond. The story she was about to tell would explain everything, but it would also reveal the deepest trauma of her military career. "During my last deployment with the Rangers, my squad was tasked with a direct action mission against a high-value target in Helmand Province," she continued. "Intelligence indicated that a Taliban commander was meeting with foreign fighters in a compound outside Marja. It was supposed to be a routine raid." Rodriguez could sense the pain in her voice and gestured for the others to remain quiet. Sarah was clearly struggling with difficult memories, and interrupting her might cause her to shut down completely. "We hit the compound at 0300 hours, Sarah went on. "Everything went wrong from the beginning. The intelligence was bad. Instead of a meeting with foreign fighters, we walked into a compound full of civilians. Women, children, elderly people. They were refugees who had been displaced by fighting in other areas." The SEALs exchanged glances, understanding now why Sarah's story was so difficult to tell. Every special operations soldier's worst nightmare was a mission that resulted in civilian casualties, especially when those casualties involved children. "The Taliban had used the civilians as shields," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "They opened fire from positions throughout the compound, and we found ourselves in a firefight where every direction we shot could hit innocent people. I was trying to treat wounded civilians while my squad returned fire, but there were too many casualties and not enough time." Morrison felt his stomach clench as he imagined the horrible situation Sarah was describing. "How many civilians were hurt?" 17 dead, including 5 children, Sarah said flatly. 23 wounded. I managed to save most of the wounded, but those 5 kids? Her voice trailed off, and she stared at her hands. Thompson spoke gently. "It wasn't your fault. You didn't know they were there." Sarah shook her head. "That's what everyone said. The investigation cleared our squad of any wrongdoing. The intelligence failure wasn't our fault, and we had acted appropriately under the circumstances. But knowing that didn't make it easier to sleep at night." Rodriguez was beginning to understand why Sarah had left the Army and joined the Navy under a different specialty. "You blamed yourself for not being able to save them." "I became obsessed with the idea that if I had been a better medic, those children might have lived," Sarah admitted. "I started training constantly, pushing myself harder and harder. I learned advanced trauma surgery, studied combat medicine at every level, even cross-trained with civilian emergency room physicians. But it still wasn't enough," Morrison said, recognizing the pattern of guilt and self-punishment that many combat veterans experienced. "I had a complete breakdown 6 months later," Sarah said simply. "PTSD, survivor's guilt, depression. I was hospitalized for 3 weeks and then medically retired from the Army. The doctors said I would never be fit for combat duty again." The revelation shocked the SEALs. The woman who had just demonstrated incredible courage and skill under fire had been declared unfit for combat by military psychiatrists. It seemed impossible to reconcile with what they had witnessed. "So how did you end up here?" Rodriguez asked. Sarah managed a small smile for the first time since beginning her story. I spent 2 years in therapy, working through my issues and learning to forgive myself for things that were beyond my control. Eventually, I realized that I still wanted to serve, but I needed to do it differently. You changed your name and joined the Navy, Thompson guessed. Sarah Chen was my mother's maiden name, she confirmed. I applied to the Navy under that identity, with medical records that showed only my physical injuries and none of my psychological treatment. It wasn't technically illegal, since my psychological discharge had been classified and expunged from most records. Morrison was struggling to process the information, but why risk coming back to combat? You could have stayed stateside and served as a hospital medic. Because I needed to prove to myself that I could still do the job, Sarah said firmly. Those children in Afghanistan died because I wasn't good enough to save them. Every soldier I can save now helps balance that equation. Rodriguez stood up and walked to the tent entrance, staring out at the base beyond. After a long moment, he turned back to face Sarah. Doc, what you did tonight saved all our lives. Peterson would have died without your medical skills, and we all would have been overrun without your combat abilities. I don't care what your real name is or what happened in your past. As far as I'm concerned, you're exactly the medic this team needs. The other SEALs nodded in agreement. They had seen Sarah's skills firsthand, and her past only made her current performance more impressive. She had overcome tremendous trauma to become an even better soldier and medic than before. There's one more thing you need to know, Sarah said quietly. My security clearance is based on false information. If this gets reported through official channels, I'll face court-martial and possibly prison time. Rodriguez looked at his teammates, and Sarah could see them communicating through subtle glances and nods. Finally, the chief spoke for all of them. Doc, what happens in the field stays in the field. Your secret is safe with us. The weeks following the firefight brought significant changes to the SEAL team's dynamics. Word of Sarah's extraordinary performance had spread throughout the base, though the details of her past remained known only to the team members who had been present that night. To the rest of the base personnel, she was simply the medic who had helped save 3 wounded SEALs during a complex enemy ambush. Peterson had recovered from his chest wound and returned to limited duty, though he would need several more weeks before being cleared for full operations. During his recovery, he sought out Sarah privately to thank her for saving his life and to apologize for revealing her identity in front of the others. Wasn't thinking clearly when I said those things, he told her as they sat in the base medical facility. I was just so grateful to see a familiar face, someone I knew I could trust. Sarah checked his chest tube insertion site, noting with satisfaction that it was healing properly. You don't need to apologize. It was probably time for the truth to come out anyway. Still, I know what it's like to try to leave your past behind, Peterson said quietly. I had my own reasons for joining the SEALs instead of staying with conventional infantry. It was the kind of conversation that had become common among the team members. Sarah's revelation about her background had encouraged others to open up about their own struggles and motivations. The team was developing a level of trust and intimacy that went beyond normal professional relationships. Rodriguez had been particularly thoughtful about integrating Sarah more fully into the team's operations. Instead of treating her as just a medic who happened to have combat skills, he began including her in tactical planning sessions and seeking her input on mission strategies. Her Ranger background provided a different perspective that often identified potential problems or opportunities that the SEALs might have missed. Your experience with urban combat could be valuable for our next mission, Rodriguez told her during one such planning session. Intelligence suggests we'll be operating in a built-up area where your Fallujah experience might apply. Sarah studied the aerial photographs and intelligence reports spread across the table. The target was a Taliban compound in a small city about 40 kilometers from their base. Unlike their previous rural operations, this mission would require moving through populated areas where civilians might be present. The key is positive identification of targets, Sarah said, pointing to specific buildings on the photographs. In Fallujah, we learned that the enemy loves to use civilian buildings as firing positions because they know we're reluctant to return fire into areas where non-combatants might be present. Morrison, who had been quietly listening to the discussion, spoke up. How do you deal with that? How do you protect civilians while still completing the mission? Sarah's expression grew serious as she recalled hard-learned lessons from her Army service. You accept that the mission will take longer and be more dangerous for your own forces. You use precision instead of overwhelming firepower, and you accept that sometimes you'll have to let enemy fighters escape rather than risk civilian casualties. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger with new orders from higher headquarters. Rodriguez read the dispatch quickly, his expression growing grim as he processed the information. "Change of plans," he announced. "Our target has been moved up to tomorrow night. Intelligence indicates that a high-value target will be present at the compound for a limited time window." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with familiar pre-mission anxiety. Despite her years of combat experience, she still felt nervous before operations, especially when they involved urban environments where anything could go wrong. "What's the target profile?" she asked. "Taliban regional commander named Mullah Hassan," Rodriguez replied. "He's responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces throughout this province. Eliminating him could significantly reduce enemy activity in our area of operations." The team spent the next several hours refining their mission plan and preparing equipment. Sarah double-checked her medical supplies and reviewed trauma treatment protocols, knowing that urban combat often produced wounds that were different from those encountered in rural firefights. Buildings could channel blast effects in unexpected ways, and ricocheting bullets could cause unusual injury patterns. As evening approached, Sarah found herself thinking about the children who had died in Fallujah 3 years earlier. The upcoming mission would be her first return to urban combat since that traumatic event, and she wasn't sure how she would react when the shooting started. Thompson noticed her preoccupation during the final equipment check. "You okay, Doc? You seem distant." Sarah looked up from organizing her medical kit. "Just thinking about tomorrow night. Urban combat is always unpredictable. You worried about civilians being present?" Thompson asked perceptively. "Always," Sarah admitted. "That's a medic's job, to preserve life, not take it. Sometimes those two responsibilities conflict with each other." Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "But you've learned to balance them. What you did during our last firefight saved all our lives. You found a way to be both a healer and a warrior when we needed you to be both." The comment helped put Sarah's fears into perspective. She had indeed learned to balance her dual roles as medic and soldier, and her performance under fire had proven that her psychological wounds from Fallujah had healed more completely than she had realized. The next evening, as the team prepared to depart for their mission, Rodriguez gathered everyone for a final briefing. The plan was relatively straightforward. Approach the target compound under cover of darkness, eliminate or capture Mullah Hassan and any associates, and withdraw before enemy reinforcements could arrive. "Remember, we want this guy alive if possible," Rodriguez emphasized. "He's got intelligence value that could help us roll up other enemy networks in the region." Sarah strapped on her body armor and checked her weapons one final time. Despite her nervousness about returning to urban combat, she felt ready for whatever the mission might bring. The support and acceptance of her SEAL teammates had given her confidence in her abilities and helped her overcome the self-doubt that had plagued her since Fallujah. As the team moved out into the Afghan night, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since joining the Navy. She had found a new family among these elite warriors, men who had accepted her completely despite the secrets and trauma of her past. More importantly, she had proven to herself that she could still be an effective soldier and medic even after experiencing devastating psychological wounds. The compound they were approaching represented both a professional challenge and a personal test. Sarah knew that her performance during this mission would determine whether she had truly overcome her past or whether the ghosts of Fallujah would continue to haunt her military career. The target compound sat in the center of a small Afghan city, surrounded by narrow streets and closely packed buildings. Sarah moved through the shadows with her SEAL teammates, her heart rate steady despite the familiar anxiety that preceded urban combat operations. 3 months had passed since her identity had been revealed to the team, and she had participated in 8 successful missions without incident. Rodriguez held up his fist, signaling the team to halt as they approached the final corner before their target. Through her night vision goggles, Sarah could see the compound clearly. A 2-story building with high walls and a single gate facing the street. Intelligence indicated that Mullah Hassan was inside with at least 6 bodyguards, but the exact number of enemy fighters remained unknown. Bravo 7. "This is Overwatch," came a whispered radio transmission from the sniper team positioned on a nearby rooftop. "We have visual on 2 sentries at the front gate. No movement visible inside the compound." Rodriguez acknowledged the report and signaled for the team to move into assault positions. The plan called for a simultaneous breach of both the front gate and a side wall, with Sarah remaining outside to provide medical support and cover any evacuation routes. As the SEALs moved into position, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through a first-floor window of the compound, she could see the silhouettes of several small figures, children who appeared to be sleeping on the floor of what should have been a secure enemy facility. "Chief, hold up," she whispered urgently into her radio. "I've got visual on what appear to be children inside the target building." Rodriguez froze in his position near the front gate. The presence of children completely changed the tactical situation and threatened to turn their precision raid into the kind of disaster that had haunted Sarah's nightmares for 3 years. "Overwatch, can you confirm civilians inside the target?" Rodriguez requested. "Affirmative," came the reply from the sniper team. "I count at least 4 children in the ground floor room, eastern side of the building." Sarah felt her chest tighten with familiar panic as memories of Fallujah came flooding back. The intelligence had been wrong again, and innocent children were about to be caught in another firefight. But this time she was in a position to prevent the tragedy instead of simply responding to it. "Chief, we need to abort," she said, her voice strained but controlled. Rodriguez's response surprised her. "Negative, Doc. We modify the plan to account for the civilians. You taught us that precision beats overwhelming force in situations like this." The SEAL leader quickly adjusted their approach, based on lessons that Sarah herself had shared from her Ranger experience. Instead of a simultaneous breach that would create chaos throughout the building, they would use a more deliberate room-by-room clearing operation that would allow them to secure the civilians before engaging enemy fighters. "Thompson, Williams, you take the side breach and secure the civilians," Rodriguez ordered. "Morrison and I will hit the front and drive the enemy fighters toward the upper floor. Doc, I need you inside with us to handle any wounded civilians." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she checked her medical kit. This was exactly the scenario she had hoped never to face again. Combat operations in close proximity to children who could be injured or killed if anything went wrong. "I can do this," she whispered to herself, repeating the mantra that had helped her through months of therapy. "I can save them this time." The assault began with Thompson and Williams blowing a small breach in the compound's side wall. They moved immediately to the room where the children were sleeping, securing them and moving them to a safe area before any enemy fighters could use them as human shields. Their professionalism and careful execution prevented the exact scenario that had resulted in civilian casualties in Fallujah. Meanwhile, Rodriguez and Morrison breached the front gate and began clearing the ground floor room by room. They encountered their first enemy fighters in what appeared to be a planning room, engaging them with precise rifle fire that eliminated the threat without damaging the surrounding structure. Sarah followed close behind the assault team, her medical kit ready and her rifle prepared for emergency use. When they reached the room where the children had been sleeping, she found Thompson and Williams standing guard over 4 young boys, ages roughly 6 to 12, who were terrified but uninjured. "Are any of you hurt?" Sarah asked in Pashto, kneeling down to examine the children for injuries. The oldest boy shook his head, his eyes wide with fear but showing no signs of physical trauma. Sarah quickly checked the others, confirming that they were all healthy despite their terrifying ordeal. "Why are these kids here?" Morrison asked as he reloaded his rifle. Before anyone could answer, automatic weapons fire erupted from the second floor as the remaining Taliban fighters tried to fight their way out of the building. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio as he coordinated the response. "Second floor is heavily defended. At least 4 fighters with good fields of fire. We need suppressive fire to allow movement." Sarah made a decision that would have been impossible 3 years earlier. Leaving the children in the care of Thompson and Williams, she moved toward the stairway leading to the second floor. Her Ranger training and combat experience made her the most qualified person to support Rodriguez and Morrison in the assault. "Doc, stay with the civilians," Rodriguez ordered over the radio. "Children are secure and uninjured," Sarah replied. "I'm moving to support your assault." She bounded up the stairway with the fluid grace that had become her trademark, her rifle ready and her mind focused on the tactical situation. At the top of the stairs, she found Rodriguez and Morrison pinned down by crossfire from 2 rooms at opposite ends of the hallway. Working with the same precision she had demonstrated during their first firefight together, Sarah began engaging the enemy fighters with carefully aimed shots that forced them to take cover. Her presence on the 2nd floor allowed Rodriguez and Morrison to advance, and within 10 minutes they had eliminated all remaining resistance. The high-value target, Mullah Hassan, was found wounded but alive in the final room. Sarah immediately began treating his injuries, her medical oath taking precedence over any personal feelings about the man who had been responsible for attacks against coalition forces. "Why are there children in this building?" Rodriguez demanded as Sarah worked to stabilize the wounded Taliban commander. Hassan, weakened by blood loss but still defiant, spat out his answer in broken English. "Those boys are orphans. Their parents were killed by American bombs. We care for them because no one else will." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The children they had been so careful to protect were war orphans, victims of the same conflict that had claimed so many lives on both sides. The Taliban fighters hadn't been using them as human shields. They had been genuinely caring for children who had nowhere else to go. As medical evacuation helicopters arrived to transport the wounded Taliban commander to detention facilities, Sarah found herself thinking about the complex realities of warfare in Afghanistan. The enemy fighters they had just defeated were also the only family that 4 orphaned boys had left in the world. "What happens to the children now?" she asked Rodriguez as they prepared to depart. "They'll be turned over to Afghan social services," he replied. "It's not ideal, but it's the best we can do under the circumstances." During the helicopter flight back to base, Sarah reflected on how different this mission had been from the disaster in Fallujah. The presence of children had been identified before the assault began, the tactical plan had been modified to protect them, and all 4 boys had emerged from the firefight completely uninjured. Most importantly, she had been able to function effectively as both a medic and a soldier, despite the emotional triggers that the situation had presented. 3 weeks later, Sarah received word that her true identity had been discovered by military investigators reviewing her service record. The false documentation that had allowed her to join the Navy under an assumed name had finally been detected, and she was being recalled to face potential court-martial proceedings. As she prepared to leave Afghanistan, the SEAL team gathered to say goodbye to the medic who had become such an integral part of their brotherhood. Rodriguez spoke for all of them when he handed her a small package containing their team patch and a letter of recommendation. "Doc, whatever happens when you get back to the States, remember that you saved a lot of lives out here. You proved that the past doesn't have to define the future." Sarah looked at the faces of the men who had become her brothers, soldiers who had seen her at her worst and her best, and had accepted her completely. Whatever legal consequences awaited her, she knew that she had found redemption in the mountains and deserts of Afghanistan. 6 months later, Sarah stood in a military courtroom wearing her dress blue Navy uniform as a judge read the verdict in her case. The court had found her guilty of falsifying enlistment documents but had sentenced her to time already served and a reduction in rank rather than imprisonment. More importantly, her actions in combat had been officially recognized with the award of a Navy Cross, making her one of the few people ever to receive high valor awards from both the Army and Navy. As she walked out of the courthouse, Sarah felt truly,